now.
Are we? Okay, great. So hi everyone, this is Gülcan from Patika. Welcome to our another great live session that we are having. Today we have a very special guest who is Aline Lerner. She is joining us from Silicon Valley. So Aline is founder and CEO of interviewing.io, which helps engineers get great jobs. I first learned about her listening to some podcasts, and I loved her insights about technical hiring. And I said, we should introduce her to our Turkish community. So that's why she's here. So thanks you so much, Aline, for joining us today. I think your insights will be so helpful to Turkish engineers as well. So there is a great movement in Turkey right now that so many people are looking for remote jobs and jobs in like top global companies. So I think your insights here will be very helpful to us. So just to start with, welcome, and please tell us about interviewing.io and yourself a little bit.
All right. Well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm CEO and founder of a company called Interviewing.io. We are trying to fix engineering hiring. It's a tall order, but we're hoping we can at least make things a little bit better. And our goal is to remove resumes as much as we can from the hiring process. So I think we all kind of know that a resume doesn't tell you whether someone is a good engineer. We've actually done some experiments around this as well. We've shown anonymized resumes to recruiters and hiring managers, and not only can they not tell what a good candidate looks like, they also all disagree with each other. So the way Interviewing.io works is we offer software engineers anonymous mock interviews with senior engineers from FANG companies. So, a lot of our interviewers are coming from Google and Facebook and Amazon. Those interviews are with another human being. They're for practice. And during those interviews, your interviewer will ask you exactly the same types of questions that you might see in a real interview. And your interviewer doesn't know who you are. So it's all about the code you write. And if you do well in practice, then no matter who you are, you get access to a bunch of great companies where you bypass the resume screen entirely. You bypass talking to recruiters, and you can just book technical interviews directly with engineers of those companies. The best part is those interviews are also anonymous. So now in a real interview, the interviewer doesn't know who you are. All they know is that you've done very well in practice. And at the end, if things go well, you unmask, and then hopefully you move to an on-site interview as soon as possible. The thing I'm most proud of with our platform is that over the 5 years that we've been doing active hiring, 40% of the hires that we've made are people that haven't looked on paper the way you'd expect. And many of them were even rejected by the same company where they had applied with their resume before they got to go through us and had the chance to show what they could do before somebody judged them by, where they went to school or where they've previously worked.
This is amazing. You said 40% of people actually couldn't pass the resume phase, but when they showed their technical skills with you, with your help, they could get into jobs. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. One of my big regrets in kind of doing this is we're not yet available in Turkey, but I hope we will be soon. I know there's so many great engineers and so much great talent there. So we're excited, and we hope that next year we can get there.
Exactly. So can you tell us a little bit about which companies hire from you?
Mm-hmm. So we have about 30 companies hiring from us at the moment. The biggest one is Amazon. And then there are companies kind of in between. There are some very small startups you probably haven't heard of. And then there are companies like Dropbox and Checker and MongoDB and a number of others.
That's awesome. And can you tell us a little bit about what were the recruiting steps before you, and how do you change that recruiting for the companies?
Yeah. So in a typical process, the first step is to get contacted by a recruiter. Now, that might sound weird because generally the way you think about a job search is that you apply to a company. So you go on their jobs page, you submit your resume or your LinkedIn, and then you hope that somebody sees it. That works sometimes, but in practice, and especially for folks that are international, chances are nobody's even looking. So if you apply online, you'll probably not hear back. And it's not because somebody looked at your resume and said, oh, this person can't do the job because of reasons. It's just that either a human didn't look or nobody looked, or maybe some automated system like did some keyword matching on the resume and then didn't see what they liked and then just rejected you. So in practice, like realistically, the first step is getting scouted by a recruiter. Now, I think we'll talk later about how to get into the process. So we'll come back to that. But once a recruiter reaches out to you, or you get on the company's radar some other way, maybe you get referred in, the next step is to have a conversation with a recruiter. And that conversation, is half hour, 45 minutes. And there you are talking about a number of different things. It's not technical at that point. They're asking you a little bit about you, maybe about your past work, what you're looking for. They'll probably also ask you your salary expectations, which you don't have to share. And many people dig themselves in a hole when they do. But, the purpose of that call is to I don't think that call is that useful, frankly. Like, it's not useful for the company or the candidate, but in theory, the purpose of that call is to make sure that you are not rule you out, right? Can this person communicate? Are they actually interested in this company? Is the kind of work that they've been doing consistent with the kind of work they might be doing, and so on and so forth. If that goes well, then the next step is usually a technical interview. Now, at some companies, the process is a little bit different, especially if you're a junior engineer, maybe if you're international. Before you talk to a human, you might have to take a test, and that varies a little bit from company to company. So you might get some kind of timed assessment where you have to write some code to solve some specific set of problems. And if you pass that, then maybe you talk to a recruiter, maybe you talk to a human. But whether there's a test or not, at some point, the next step is going to be a technical interview. And there, you usually meet with an engineer who works at the company in a collaborative coding environment with video. And they give you some kind of problem to do. They say, write a function that does X, Y, Z. And then you are supposed to talk about your thought process and, explain your solution, ask a lot of clarifying questions about, what they're actually looking for, write some code, test your code, talk about the efficiency of your code, and then maybe make some optimizations. And then your interviewer might change the problem up a little bit and say, okay, well, that works, but now let's pretend that this is streaming instead of, just a normal input or something like that. Or how would we change this if this had to work across a bunch of different machines, or other questions that layer on complexity. If that goes well, then the next step is an on-site. In the current climate, it'll be a virtual on-site. And there you're going to talk to, 5 people, depending on what kind of role you're applying for. The details will be different, but you will still have to write more code. You'll probably have to do some systems design problems, especially if you're a little bit more experienced. They'll also be evaluating you on probably your ability to prioritize. At companies like Amazon at this stage, they also do something called leadership principles, where they are trying to evaluate some like non-technical abilities that you have. Do you take initiative? Are you good at teamwork? Are you, do you have potential to, become a leader at the company in the future? And that's a very specific set of questions with a very specific set of expectations. But at the end of that virtual onsite, hopefully, in a few days to a few weeks, you hear back. And at some companies, then if things went well, you move to a team matching portion. At some companies, so one of the differences between like an Amazon and a Google is at Amazon, you interview for a specific team from the beginning. At Google and at Facebook, you do sort of a general interview to just assess whether you're strong technically and non-technically, and you don't really know what team you're going to end up on till later. At Facebook, you actually go through a whole orientation first and like do a little boot camp before they even assign you to a team. At Google, once you've passed the interview, I guess at some of these companies too, I forgot, there's a hiring committee step. So you pass the interview, they create a whole packet. This is such a long like just talking about it is exhausting. Like doing this is like, right?
Yeah, I was thinking, how long does it take from start to end?
Yes, I'll answer that in a moment. We're almost through this kind of Kafka-esque process. So if you did well in your onsite, a recruiter kind of creates this packet that has your resume and all the feedback from all your various interviews. And then I don't know if it's like every Monday or every second Monday, like some day of the week, there's this committee that meets, and they've never met any of the people that are being presented to them. They just get these packets, and then they go through the packets and they're like, is this person somebody that would be a fit for this company based on criteria? And then if that's a thumbs up, then you do team matching, where you do sort of like a speed dating with product managers from a few different teams. And they ask you about you and what you're interested in, and they tell you what projects are coming up. And then hopefully there's a situation where you're excited about the team and they're excited about you. And finally, at that point, hopefully you get an offer with some numbers. And then from there, maybe you negotiate a little bit and hopefully you take it and you start. Gosh, that's a long process, huh?
Wow, yeah. And really, like, how long does it take? How many months, I would say?
So I guess disclaimer, I have never worked for a FANG company. A lot of our users are either interviewers for FANG or looking to get into FANG. So like, and I've been a recruiter for before I was an engineer, then I was a recruiter. So like I've seen stuff, but I've never worked at one of these companies. So, disclaimers. But from what we've observed among our users, the quickest you can get through one of these large company processes end to end, like, and let's say from the moment that you have your first contact with a recruiter over LinkedIn or email or something to the moment when you have an offer in hand, it's months, right? So, probably the quickest I've seen something is 6 weeks, but that was not at a company that had that team matching and hiring committee, because those things tend to tack on, like with hiring committee, they put your packet in, to the next meeting. So it might be like a week or more before that meeting even happens. So 6 weeks is probably the shortest, but I wouldn't count on that. I mean, realistically, it's like 2 or more months.
Mm-hmm. Wow, this is crazy. And hopefully this is different for startups and for more smaller companies, but is it the case?
Yes. So startups generally can't pay as much as FANG, but from a recruiting standpoint, one of their advantages is their speed. So depends on the size of the startup. Very small startups, like Interviewing.io, my company is 10 people right now. So we can get from first conversation to an offer in a week. We don't always do that. Sometimes it can take a little bit longer. The biggest bottleneck is typically scheduling the virtual onsite, because, you need 5 people's time, and then the person you're interviewing also has to be available. But that is generally like the biggest time sink is just scheduling. For larger startups, so we're at Series A stage. For companies that are larger, maybe they're Series B, or like maybe they're, all the way up to pre-IPO. The longest it takes is probably around 6 weeks, but things can generally get turned around anywhere between like 3 and 5 or 6.
Yeah, I see. And so in this process, the technical interviews and test part and everything, so there is a lot of algorithm questions, as I know, and a lot of especially experienced developers say that, oh, I forgot this. I mean, they have been years ago and they are not related to the real work that I will do on the job. So there is a lot of criticism around this. So So what do you think about this? Is it valid? Is it a real, just a true criticism? And do you think that this is going to change in time just because of this inefficiency?
Yeah, really great question. So my personal view on this is that whether an interview goes well and whether an interviewee feels like this is the kind of work they do every day or not is much more a function of how good the interviewer is than what questions are being asked. Now, there are some exceptions, right? I've seen questions that require you to know some obscure data structure that you maybe like covered once in a class 10 years ago, and you've never, ever, ever used it in your professional life. Those interviews, I would say, are bad. But, I think for most interviews, whether an engineer will feel like this was indicative of their skills or not depends on how experienced the interviewer is, how many times they've asked the question that they're asking, because there's always more than one way to solve a problem. And an experienced interviewer will be familiar with like every single way. And they'll also be familiar with the mistakes that people can make and know how to like gently like let them, struggle a little bit, but then bring them back before they fall off the edge of a cliff. It depends on how engaged the interviewer is during the interview. So, there are a lot of interviewers that don't really pay attention, don't give you good hints. Some interviewers will ding you for not using correct terminology or for forgetting something. But if the interviewer is good, and the best summary I ever heard, or like the best sort of point of an interview that I ever heard was from a very experienced interviewer. And he said, the point of an interview is to see if we can be smart together. And I think those interviews are great. Like, and it doesn't really like, yes, you can be writing code, you can be solving an algorithmic problem. But if it's collaborative, and if the interviewer is asking the right questions and giving the right context and forgiving people for things that don't matter and evaluating them on what matters, I would say in the hands of a great interviewer, you can take a pretty generic algorithmic question and turn it into a great experience that evaluates a candidate fairly. And you can take a really good question, put it in the hands of an unengaged and experienced interviewer, and the interviewee is going to walk out feeling like that was not a good way to test their ability. So all that said, I mean, I firmly believe that if you're applying to be an engineer, your interviews should involve writing code. But I think that it's important not to ask questions that rely on knowing something obscure or like having, one thing click, and maybe it clicks in your head 50, maybe if you had breakfast that day, it would have clicked, right? Or if you slept a little better the night before, it would have clicked. Those questions aren't good. But again, a good interviewer, even if they ask that kind of question, will gently like get you to where you need to be.
Okay, this is a great answer. I think it makes a lot of sense. And so
you're also asking, there's a second part, a very long answer to a short question. It's something I'm very passionate about, but you were asking if this was likely to change.
Yes.
I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. The standards for this industry, right, and how companies interview are often set by FANG, and actually Microsoft started a lot of this stuff. I mean, they're kind of FANG, right? And the reason these questions are the way they are isn't necessarily because they're the best way to vet people, but because when you're one of these companies, there's sort of two things that are true for you that are not true for others. One is you have a bunch of candidates applying to you. So your process actually doesn't have to be that good. It just has to be right more than half the time. So it just has to be slightly better than a coin flip for outcomes. And then over time, you will still, meet your hiring goals because you have this infinite supply of people that are coming in. And the other one is the reason these questions are the way they are, in theory, the idea is we want to evaluate people's ability to think rather than their ability to, rather than like specific stuff they know. But what ends up happening is that these questions are used because they're easy to scale. Like you don't have to train interviewers that much. You don't have to have custom questions for each team, right? This is how we do things. And then if an interviewer is sick one day, or if we grew really fast, we can just plug in other interviewers, and the whole system just still works as long as it's better than a coin flip. So what ends up happening is smaller companies look at a Google and they say, well, Google has all these great engineers, so let me copy their process. It doesn't really work for smaller companies. And these companies, the big ones, are good at hiring, I'd say, despite their process and not because of it. But as long as they're setting the standard, right, for everybody else, and this is working for them, it's probably not going to change.
Yeah, makes sense. But at the same time, I'm just wondering, I mean, even these big FANG companies are complaining about, it takes so long time, they are complaining about lack of talent in the market. I mean, they are also not super happy, as I see, about the process, because, their engineers are also suffering from, I need people in my team. I cannot find them fast enough. But even though that's the case, it is a standard, and we don't expect it to change, and we don't see that change, at least now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in order for this to actually change, it has to probably cause way more pain than the pain of changing the process. So I think that also the people that are typically, and this is a bit of my own personal bias, but the people that are generally responsible for what an interview process looks like are not even necessarily engineers, right? It's an army of recruiters, and those people are very invested in the status quo because that's what keeps them employed. So I think to drive like massive change across hiring is going to take a pretty big shakeup, where a new way of doing it is going to be 10 times faster or 100 times faster. And I don't know, like, we are trying to be that. I hope we are that. Maybe it's going to be somebody else. Maybe it'll be, a different way of interviewing. But until something is an order of magnitude faster and it has the right incentives for companies to adopt it, it's probably not going to get adopted.
Yeah.
And that sucks.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay. And so as we see, just a lot of remote job postings, especially, are for more senior people or mid-level people. And so in our community, there are so many junior engineers that are just trying to find their first job. So they ask this question a lot. They said, how can a junior developer get great jobs in these companies, or maybe remote jobs in international companies? I mean, do you see that as an opportunity? And if so, like, how can they get ready for these interviews?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes, there's opportunity, but it's also really hard because, if you're trying to get into a US company, you're not just competing with other junior international people, you're also competing with all the junior US-based people. It's pretty rough for junior US-based engineers right now. And if you're international, that creates a whole other layer of complexity. Now, the good news is that companies are much more open to hiring remote, but it's not going to be like, if you ask, I think most startups where you're probably more likely to succeed at getting your first job, would you ever go out of your way to find a junior international engineer? They'd probably say no, because one, there's not that much appetite for hiring junior engineers because you have to commit so much to mentoring them. And then two, the time zone difference adds a lot of complexity, right? And typically, if you're hiring people in different time zones, you're looking for somebody that's already experienced with working remotely, because they have to be so self-directed and they have to know how to manage their time, and they have to know, just knowing how to communicate and over communicate, and make sure to advocate for yourself so you're still part of the team even though you're in a different time zone and never met anybody in person. That's really hard, and it's a skill. So I think that there's a lot of friction already in place. But what I would recommend, and this is what I recommend to junior engineers in the US as well, applying to companies online will not do you any favors, because we talked about this earlier, probably nobody is looking at it. And especially if you're junior, there are so many other applications just like yours that, it probably doesn't, when companies are hiring junior engineers, they typically go to career fairs at a few universities in the US, And that fills most of their junior engineer quota without them ever having to look at the big pile of applications that they're getting. And that really sucks because they don't tell you that, right? And you kind of have this impression that if you apply, you're being evaluated fairly against everybody else. And even if there are a lot of applicants, if you put a lot of work in your resume, then you will stand out. Like, that's just not how it works. So what I would recommend is just not playing that game and just opting out. And instead, if you're looking at startups, doing a lot of homework, finding the people that work at that startup that you think would be most interested in talking to. So if it's a small startup, maybe you just reach out directly to the founder. If it's like 15 or fewer people, if it's bigger than that, maybe you find a director or VP of engineering and you find that person's info. So find out who this person is, do a little bit of homework, and you can find them on LinkedIn. Then do a little bit of homework on them, right? Maybe they've written stuff on the company blog. Maybe they've done talks. Just, see if you can find something about them that will help you write to them in a very personal way. And then send them an email. And I say email. And by the way, this should not be a recruiter. You should not be contacting recruiters because they are not incentivized to help you. Recruiters don't care about junior candidates generally, because it is not their job to recruit. Even university recruiters don't care about junior candidates because their job is going to career fairs. So recruiters are not incentivized to help you. It will not help their career to help you. But if you reach out to a founder or an engineering leader, that's a different story. So don't reach out on LinkedIn. People that are engineers typically don't check LinkedIn very much unless they're maybe looking for work. But generally, all they get on LinkedIn is spam from recruiters. So it's noise. They're not looking there. So find the person's email. Typically, it's their first name at the company domain. You can guess it. Chances are you can just do a little bit of homework and then send them a short but thoughtful email introducing yourself and talking about what the company is doing and why you're interested, and maybe even asking for advice. But sound like a real person. Like, don't put a cover letter in there. Don't sound all businessy. Talk instead about, like, make yourself sound like a smart person who's interested in things. And, maybe even you do some kind of very unglamorous part-time work. Like maybe they need somebody to do some QA testing to start. Like every startup needs help with random stuff. And if you're willing to do random stuff, then you'll get your foot in the door. And then before you know it, you'll be writing code. We had an intern who was in high school, actually, when he started working for us, and he was just doing like office work. And he ended up being an amazing, he started writing code. He was more productive than a lot of pretty experienced engineers that I know. And he was with us for several years whenever he had time. And that was a great thing to do. And there are plenty of people like that. And startups tend to be more open to it because there's less structure and they don't necessarily have a specific role they need to fill, but you have to talk to the right person. So what I tell people is to look at it like a sales process. Pretend you're a salesperson and pretend you're going door to door. You're going to have to knock on a lot of doors to get an answer, but that's okay. That's expected. It's expected. Don't take it personally. And just, if you try, it will work out.
Mm-hmm. I think this is such an honest and so clear feedback to junior people. I hope that you took note, those who are junior engineers looking for jobs. And so I want to also clarify something. Junior engineer or senior engineer definition is different from country to country, from maybe cultural to culture even. So what I see in Turkey, which is a little bit alarming, is people who have been experienced just for a few years, they start calling themselves mid-engineers, mid-year engineers, or senior engineers. So, but as I see in the US, it is a little bit different. So how do you see, I know that it is very shallow to classify it based on the years of experience, but what would you call, who is a junior developer for you? And after how many years or what kind of experience would you call them a senior or mid-level person?
I think titling is not consistent in the US either. And each company has their own sort of titles and bands, and they mean different things. But in general, and this is very, very loose, junior is like 0 to 1 or 2 years. Intermediate is 2 to 3 or 4, right? And then senior is generally 4 or 5 plus. That doesn't include internships, right? So if you worked as an intern for every summer during college, that doesn't count as a year of experience. That is still 0. But by the time you're 4 years out, you can potentially get a senior engineer title. Not always. Sometimes it takes a little more than that. A lot of it too depends on how well you interview. So your leveling, especially at FANG companies, is kind of dependent on, you can have people with a lot less experience get a senior title, and people with a senior title end up with kind of not a senior title, depending on how their interview process goes.
Okay. Yeah. And then based on what you say, yeah, it is not too different from what we see in Turkey as well. So yeah, that's good to hear. And for those who don't have a computer science degree or an engineering degree, so are they disadvantaged in these applications, do you think? And if that is the case, how can they overcome it?
The answer is unfortunately yes. It is already true for US-based engineers. And I hate to say that US-based engineers have an easier time of this, but they do. So even if you don't have a CS degree and you are a junior engineer in the US, especially if this is your first, let's say you're self-taught, or maybe you went to a boot camp or something, you're going to have a devil of a time getting your foot in the door. In some ways, going to a boot camp is actually not a good thing, because companies now have a bit of a bias against boot camp grads, right? Because some of them are great, but a lot of them are not prepared for interviews. And then the more of them you talk to, and the more you see that they're not prepared for interviews, the more that bias reinforces itself. So if you're a what we call non-traditional candidate who is from outside the US, you're going to have a hard time. And I think that the best thing you can do is, so there are 2 hard things about getting a job. One is getting your foot in the door and getting a human to actually notice you. And then the second one is doing well in interviews. And you have to be strategic about how much effort you put into which of these 2 things when. So of course, the first thing is it's important to get noticed. So I tell people you should start preparing for interviews in parallel with doing this big sales style outreach and finding hiring managers and finding directors and VPs and maybe founders. If you're a non-traditional engineer from outside the US, just getting noticed will probably take you, 6 months of a lot of effort. And then while you're doing that, it is important to practice for interviews, especially if you're non-traditional, because that means that you may not have ever had an algorithms class, right? Or it might be stuff that you taught yourself. So while you're spending half your day sending personalized emails to a lot of people, then you're probably spending the other half of your day preparing for interviews, so that when something works out, and it can happen very quickly, or it can happen after months and months and months, you're ready to go. But I think especially so for non-traditional people, both of these are really hard, because getting noticed is going to be harder, and filling in those gaps in your knowledge is also going to be hard. I wish I had something more positive to say here, but it's a slog, and it gets easier once you get your first job, but getting that first one is so difficult. And I feel so much for the people that are going through that.
Yeah, but I mean, it is important to know that it's going to be hard, and you have to prepare based on that. I mean,
it's hard for everybody, right? Every person's experience is miserable and bad, but it's not just you.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. I mean, it's not only for developers, programmers, it is for any any profession, it takes a while to find your first job. It is always the hardest part. And then after that, it gets much easier. So that's very normal. But I was going to ask these questions later, but because we already started talking about it, let me ask it. So you said prepare for the interviews. And so what are the resources that you will suggest people to use when preparing for interviews?
So there's actually one company that I was thinking before today, what I could say here. Of course, I want to say Interviewing.io, but we're not available in Turkey, so that's not that useful to people. There is an amazing company called Out Talent, OUT Talent, and they specialize specifically in helping people from outside the US get their first job at engineers. This is just for engineers that are outside the US to get their first job at a FANG company. And that is what they do. A friend of mine runs it. I think they're doing amazing work. It's not free. I think the way they do it is you don't pay anything up front. And then once you get in, you pay them something like that's some portion of your salary. And they're very, very selective. They're looking for very specific things and specific kinds of people. But once you're in, there's such a support system, right? There's a whole community, and they take you from A to B, right? They get you all the interview prep that you need. They actually use Interviewing.io to help their people prepare. So that's why, I'm advocate. I know they do a great job. And then they also help you get into the company. So they do everything end to end. And it's such a supportive, wonderful community of people. So I can't recommend them enough. And they don't know I'm doing this. So they didn't ask me to plug them. I just really like them. Other resources. So of course, most of your community will have heard of LeetCode. I think one mistake, LeetCode is great. But one mistake that people make is I think they spend too much time grinding on LeetCode. I think there are diminishing returns after you get to a certain point. So, you should be able to solve easy and medium LeetCode problems, but at some point you need to practice interviewing with another human, because it is very, very different to solve problems on your own and then have somebody actually breathing down your neck and asking you follow-up questions. And just, if you haven't done these interviews before, just getting in the habit of speaking your thoughts takes time, right? Because the tendency is to go quiet and start like scribbling on a piece of paper. But that is not like a good pattern for these interviews. You have to say what you're thinking. So LeetCode is a good place to start to sort of prepare to get to a certain point. And then once, you're at that point, I even tell like our users, if you're comfortable writing a function that finds the minimum or maximum in an array of integers, you're probably ready to practice with a human. In terms of other resources for practicing with humans, there is a site called PRAMP, PRAMP. That's peer-to-peer practice. So it's not the same as practicing with a professional, but at least there's going to be another human on the end, and they'll give both of you a question. And I think the way it works is for half the time, I'm the interviewer and you're the interviewee. And then we switch roles. So we're kind of helping each other. I think that's a good resource. There are some other interview practice sites that are not free, and they may be available outside the US. You can kind of look around. They're not cheap. I think an interview will run you, if you do use one of these mock interview services, at least $100 per session, maybe more. So that may not be a great solution. So I would start with like LeetCode and PRAMP, and definitely check out Talent as well. And of course, there's also HackerRank. That's a good one too. HackerRank is a tool that a lot of companies also use for their assessments. We talked earlier about how sometimes the process has a test before you talk to a human. But in addition to providing those tests to companies, HackerRank also has a place where people can practice on their own.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I think these are great. I heard really good resources, and we will provide it in our, just below our YouTube video, you will see those links that are suggested for you. And so I have one more question, and then we'll jump into the questions of our community. And just in maybe 10 minutes, we will be ending the session because Aline has another engagement. But so again, I will go to more like junior questions. But so you said that there are so many things to get into your first job. And let's say that a person is in college and they are already studying engineering, what they can do just when they have so much time in their life to prepare for this challenging time.
Are they like a college senior or a junior? Like where senior?
Yeah, let's say they are just about to graduate.
About to graduate. So bad news, your preparation should have started like way before that. So I would say by the time you're a senior, you should be pretty well versed in technical interviewing. And like one thing, you know, that is we take for granted, right, is your ability to write well in English. So that's also really important, and that can take years. So if you are, you know, just starting college, think about what you can do to practice English, especially written English, but also spoken English. That's important. If you're applying to US-based companies. If it's not, then you don't have to know it. So that's one. I think depending on where you're studying and how much they have in the curriculum for technical interviews, which they may not have a lot of, I would supplement your curriculum with, you know, maybe some algorithms classes on Coursera. There's a blog post I wrote a while ago where I have a list of MOOC classes that our best performing users have taken. It's called, here, actually, can I link you to it? I think that might be helpful.
Yeah, that would be great. We can put the link under YouTube.
Yeah, I think I can find it quickly. Yes. Okay, awesome. I think this is it. Let me just check. And I also hope these classes are still, yep, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to drop this in the chat here. So there's a section here that has a list of Udacity and Coursera classes. There are 3 on Udacity and 4 on Coursera. A lot of them are about algorithms and you know, things like functional programming, which can also just help you get better at solving algorithmic problems. So, you know, take some of those as soon as you can, and then just, you know, get on LeetCode, get on HackerRank, and in addition to your coursework, just get used to solving these kinds of problems. And even for people, according to our research, right, even for experienced engineers, it can take months of interview prep before they actually start talking to companies. So if you're not experienced in these, it may be good to, you know, in the year before you expect to start looking for work, to make solving these problems a part of your routine.
Okay, this is awesome. And actually, there's a question that came from YouTube. I really find this fun. It says that, so when we apply to a job and we are rejected, but it says that just we had another better candidate, but you can apply again anytime. So is it true? I mean, should we apply again? Or
no,
so what is the situation?
I mean, I think that chances are so it depends on how you define truth and lies, right? The fact is they did have another candidate, but the way that's worded kind of leads you to believe that they were looking at your application and they were looking at this other application and they read yours and then they read the other one and they're like, okay, this is a better candidate. Sorry, that's not what happened. They probably never looked at yours, and yes, there is another candidate, so they're not technically lying. But I'll sort of reiterate what I said earlier. Applying online just will not do you any favors. That is a polite message because they wanted to say something, but chances are a human never looked at your application. So you should accept that it's like screaming into a black hole, and then get to work on finding contacts within that company and figuring out how to get in front of them.
Okay, I love your transparency and honesty. I think this is what we need to hear, but this is great. I love it. And so another question is, so what are the challenges of more senior developers in these technical interviews?
Yeah, well, it's what you said earlier, right? You are not necessarily using that part of your brain every day at work. And the further removed you are from the algorithms class that you took in college, the rustier you get. There are exceptions. Like there are some software engineering positions where you're doing a lot of algorithmic kinds of problems, but for the most part, like you're not. So the challenge for senior engineers is that they're rusty. And at the same time, there's kind of more pressure on them, especially like, you know, you may not feel very sorry for these people because, you know, that poor Google engineer who's trying to get into Facebook, but like a good chunk of our users are like Google engineers who are trying to get into Facebook and Facebook engineers who are trying to get into Google. And they are feeling a lot of pressure because when somebody sees Google on your resume, they're expecting you to interview at a certain level, but you're rusty and you forgot this stuff. A lot of our best performers, like over a third, actually fail their first practice interview. And, you know, more than half of those people are already at top companies.
Wow. So this is so impressive, I think. So you have engineers from Google, Facebook, practicing technical interviews at interviewing.io. That is, I want
to get from like, yeah, or like engineers at Lyft who want to get into Uber, or like, you know, that is a testament, I think, to how broken this process is. But that's the reality that we're in.
Yeah, this is awesome. I think so. We learned a lot of interesting things in this interview. Thank you so much, Aline, for your time. I think this was great. And so we will put the resources that you suggested under our YouTube video. And hope that interviewing.io will be available in Turkey sometimes. If so, we definitely will let our community know. But thank you so much for all these insights that you shared. This was great.
Yeah, of course. Listen, if it's useful, like if there's anybody that is US based in your audience, let me just drop something else in here. So there's this code. If you use that code, you will get $100 off your first interviewing.io interview. And our cheapest ones are $120. So basically you get a algorithmic technical mock interview with an engineer from a top company for like $20. So I hope that's useful. I know that's not useful to most of the folks here, but I hope we'll be available in Turkey soon as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for the discount. That's awesome. And good luck to you in your job. I mean, this is a very interesting business model. And it's great that you're helping a lot of people go through this very challenging and sometimes annoying process. This is great. Thank you so much.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, bye.